Okay, so Lilith, my next question is quite often when I'm on Twitter in particular, but I see them in other places as well, is I see religious people of all stripes, not just Christians, stating things as if they're absolute fact. And yet, quite often it's stuff to the rest of us sounds like just absolute crazyville. Stuff about what angels do and, demons and all the rest of it. And, to us that sounds crazy, but they state these things like they're absolute facts. And I want to know, where does that certitude come from?
It's a difficult thing to express because, of course, you think of things critically. You hear an assertion and you say, that's interesting. What is the evidence? And you start to think of what you know and does it fit in? And if it doesn't, you're ready to discard it. For the Christian, that is not possible. I spoke already of the fear that keeps Christians close to the hearth of certain fundamental doctrines, shall we say. But then, when Christians find anything or hear anything, regardless of sourcing, without any sourcing, in fact, that supports their position, they will grab onto it as if it's valid. They don't actually take the time to look into the sources, to doubt it. It supports their position, so it's legitimate. I realize that to the free mind, this sounds absolutely absurd, but I think, much as it pains me, the best example of this would be a conversation I had with my father. My father, over the last several years, has moved away from fundamentalism. He has become a universalist because he has thought about it, and he believes in a God that is as good as he is, and that God would never send anyone to hell, at least not permanently, perhaps short-term punishment for maybe you have to learn your lesson, but eternal conscious torment, no, never. Because my father is better than that, so he can't conceive of a good God not being as good as he is, which is fair. But I asked him what the evidence was for this, and he didn't understand the question, so I had to lay it out very quickly. I said, make no mistake. The version of God you are presenting to me is far superior morally to the standard Christian concept of God. It's far better. I do not criticize it on those grounds. But what evidence do you have that your concept of God, which, again, far superior to your standard Christianity, but what evidence do you have that that is the God of reality? And he stopped and said, I'll have to get back to you on that one.
Has he?
No.
No.
I give him credit that he recognized the disconnect. And granted, he has other things to concern himself with right now. He and my mother are unfortunately both in a high-risk situation for COVID. But I realized at that moment how unnatural it was to him, to me, to tens of thousands, possibly millions of evangelicals, to understand the requirements for evidence. If something supports your position, it doesn't mean it's true. And that thought doesn't occur to them, not just in the heat of debate, when any of us might be guilty of taking anything that supports our view because we're in that reactionary moment of, no. But afterwards, in the calm, in the silence, there is no thought that we should check and make sure that maybe this story isn't true, even if it does support our view.
Yeah.
There's no consideration on that point.
I've got a couple of examples on this this one again. So let's see if we can. Oh no, that's not it.
I will be the Christopher Hitchens session.
Yes. So here's a tweet. It's just stated as if it's actual, just fact, and yet absolutely none of it has any backing whatsoever. Here's a man who ought to understand evolution by now.
He's been talking about it for how many decades now? 3, 4? I don't even know.
I know, but I guess if he started to accept what he was told, he'd lose his large income. And yeah, I love this one. You've got to read this tweet first. How can you not believe in God after seeing this? And then this guy just points out the difference in the melting point of gold and the heat of a wood fire. It's like,
God.
Your scientific ignorance is just, not evidence for God. That's the way I see it.
This is the mistake that many atheists make.
Yeah.
They try to correct the ignorance before they point it out. You've got a person on the other side of that debate, and they need to see the ignorance of their position before they can address it. People want to be like, well, blah, 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 facts, 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 facts. It just goes over their head. Because, again, they are clipped close to the hearth by fear of hearing the words, I never knew you.
I think
Depart from me, evildoers.
I think this comes down, the other day when we had our discussion about doing this, we talked about the, and I talked about it this morning with MathPig as well, about the video where Aaron Ra goes out with Anthony Magnabosco. And,
oh, bless him, he can't do that.
No. And Anthony Magnabosco gets people to actually think about their position and what they're saying. And with Aaron, the first time they said something stupid, he just gave them an avalanche of logic bomb. It was just so classic.
He does. And I understand Aaron Ra, and I respect him because he values truth above all.
Absolutely.
As I do.
Yeah, I mean, he's fantastic.
As I always have.
He's so smart, and he knows so much stuff. But he's just got such a short fuse for bullshit.
The one thing that I want to contribute to our community, the one way in which I could distinguish myself from other people, is that I truly believed, and I truly tried to find accuracy in the belief. And I have a remarkable memory for stories and for the tales of Christianity, which ultimately led to my deconversion. But I know what they fear. I know the questions they hope you won't ask. I know the pitfalls that they are studiously avoiding even as they speak to you.
I think that's clear when I see you respond to people's tweets, that you come from that perspective. Okay, Lily. I know I've been keeping you a long time, but I've just got 2 more questions, and we'll see how we go with these. I'm always baffled by why some religious people, I know it's not all, have a problem with the theory of evolution. The theory of evolution has got tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of papers that support it from multiple lines of evidence over 150 years. And creationists have, a chapter in a very old book written by people who didn't know where the sun went at night. And yet, they, first of all, they object. And secondly, their objections seem to make no sense to me. I mean, why are there still monkeys are the sort of questions they ask? Now, if they only have to Google it, and they'll find that sort of question is not something that can falsify evolution. And then they come up with other things, second law of thermodynamics and so on. But I want to know what your take was, 6 or 7 years ago when you were a Christian. And just go for it.
Well, I will admit, of course. Of course. The truth is, I gave up young earth creationism long before I gave up Christianity. I understand now so many things in retrospect that I didn't understand as I was going through them. Christianity is not a monolith. It is something that is interpreted in many different ways. But as I've pointed out several times throughout this, the fundamentalist fear is the idea that if they get just a little bit away from the most core principles, Christ will discard them as something lukewarm and just repulsive to him. That's a lot of the fear that defines the creationist movement, or at least the sincere elements. I have to admit that on consideration, I have to come to the conclusion that the majority of those who at least lead and profit from the creationist movement are in fact narcissists who don't give a flying fuck about the truth and just want to shill as many people as they can for as much as they can. Kent Hovind is an eminent example I can think of, but
he's eminent, all right.
I've had that suspicion about most of them.
I thought I didn't have anything to share on this one, but I actually do. Yeah, so here's an explanation of allopatric speciation, where you have a population that divides perhaps by a geographical barrier, and then there's different evolutionary stresses on either side, and you end up with two. So it's very easy to see that if this half was the monkeys, and this side was another group of monkeys, but the evolutionary pressures drove us towards, the great apes over here, it's easy to see why they're still monkeys, and why the great apes, including us, came about. I think there's nothing more obvious than this to me.
Well, there is, if you understand evolution. Basically, the question of if we came from monkeys, how are there still monkeys, would be on a scaled sense. Basically, it would come down to this. If my cousin isn't my grandmother, how are we related? Now, people who object to evolution would be horrified at the similarity being asserted between these two questions, but in fact, they're exactly the same damn question on a slightly different scale, but essentially the same.
I use a couple of different examples here, such as most Australians are of European descent. So if most Australians are European, why are they still Europeans? And the other one that I use is when I'm in that sort of mood, is if man came from dust, why do I have to still sweep my porch on a regular basis?
Well, I mean, if man comes from dust and incest, because let's face it, the Bible is all about the incest. It's a little disturbing, to be quite honest. But again, same thing, fear. If I don't affirm the authority of the Bible, God will discard me like used Kleenex, if I'm going to be very polite. So basically, creationists, scholars, and leaders such as Ken Ham, Kent Hovind, Ray Comfort, just the whole lot of them, that dopey fellow from Canada who has a Mensa, Ian Duby.
Oh, yeah.
What? Yes, I know, he's painful to watch, but what all of them have done, consciously or unconsciously, has deliberately spread an understanding of evolution that is absurd. What they have done is try to make evolution, the version of it that they are presenting to children who don't know any better, More absurd than 6-day magical creation.
That takes some doing.
It does, but it has been done. There was an interview, it was a dialogue on a larger program between Richard Dawkins and an Australian politician. I don't recall his name off the top of my head. I apologize. About evolution, and this politician thought he was being very, very understanding and very well. I don't pressure anyone else. That's just what I believe. And Richard Dawkins said, "How can you believe this?" And the politician answered, "Well, my question is, if dogs had to evolve, over millions of years, how would they have evolved a urinary tract?" Basically, the way he phrased it, and again, please do look this up because I can't recall exactly how he phrased it. It was very painful to watch. But the idea being that there had just been rolling around a bunch of meat that eventually, over millions of years, turned into a dog. And at some point during that had to develop a urinary tract because that's necessary for life. And
so like every species develops these things from scratch as they're evolving and not...
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Because
magic.
So there are people, many, many people, who have taught their children to think that that is what evolution is. That it's essentially 6-day creationism, but very, very slowly. Because that's the only way to make it more absurd than creationism. Richard Dawkins didn't understand the question, or didn't think he understood the question. He had enough respect for his opponent to think that he couldn't possibly mean what he said. And I do believe that his refusal to debate creationists came after that, because the question, to anyone who understood evolution in any sense, is positively an insult to their intellect.
Absolutely.
But I don't believe that was what was intended by the individual involved. I believe he actually thought that was a rational question. And that is an example, I think, to unbelievers, particularly anyone, believer or unbeliever, who understands the science behind these natural processes, to how far into delusion they have taken the concept of evolution in order to make it more absurd than their own beliefs, so that creationism appears more reasonable. That is literally the only trick that they have up their sleeve, but they have been driving at this nail, pecking at this point for at least half a century.
I think there's a book in what you're saying here. I really do. I think there's a book in what you're saying here. I really do. I really do. Just a couple of other things. I've used this picture a few times in my videos. Completely consistent with the Genesis view of the universe. And when they use the second law of thermodynamics as an example, I mean, this would be massive if you think about it. If you looked at some of the flat Earth models, so you would still be able to, put in my, sort of non-understanding of science hat on here for a second myself, but you would be able to create order in places under this dome, at least for a time, because in general the entropy would increase throughout the whole dome. So after a while you wouldn't be able to do it because of energy gradients and things. But when they say that nothing could happen because of the second law of thermodynamics, even in this system you would be able to get some things to happen at least for a time. But of course, if I've got it here, the Earth is not a closed system, at least with respect to energy.
They don't remember. They don't tell you about the closed system. They say all things move towards entropy and they stop at that point.
Yeah.
Again, they have no shame whatsoever in cutting off the end of the sentence, even if it's a completely fundamental aspect of the entire system and model. It doesn't matter that the Earth is not a closed system, not an isolated system, nothing of the kind, that it is constantly receiving energy, because they didn't get that far. They only got to the first sentence and they stopped there.
Yeah.
And they are going to hold that sentence and beat you over the head with it until it is broken and dead, and they're going to keep flailing it at you without the slightest understanding of context.
Yeah, a question that I've seen asked of creationists is, how many laws of thermodynamics are there?
Oh dear.
They never seem to know. They never seem to know. Okay, I've got one more question to deal with, and
yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, Lilith. Well, my last question to you is, if you think about yourself a few years ago compared to now, what would your view have been on marriage equality?
Oh dear. It's quite shameful to admit that I opposed marriage equality. Even in 2005, when I'm quite proud now to say that Canada affirmed marriage equality ahead of many, many countries in the world.
We were behind the United States here in Australia, which is hard to believe, but yeah.
I was part of a church that signed a petition against marriage equality. Of course, Canadian against marriage equality. So it was, we do not agree and we have undersigned. It was not burn the gays because God hates and burning and such. But it still wasn't right. It still wasn't right at all. Homosexuality is, it's one of the few things that even as a Christian, I couldn't hang on to. I was willing even to be dishonest with the Bible in the end, just because homosexuality was obviously so natural and healthy for some people. Obviously not everybody, but some people, clearly. Marriage equality was something that, again, fell into that vortex of fear. That vortex of, if I don't affirm enough things correctly, Jesus will discard me like a used tissue. And again, finally, I came to the position where human beings needed my help and God didn't. And human beings were helped by their healthy same-sex relationships. And God didn't need shit from me. So ultimately, I came to affirm that. I actually write an article in my blog, which I began when I was still Christian and actually sort of spans the process of my deconversion. And I wrote that I did what I had never done before or since, which was look up specifically arguments to support what I wanted to. And that is true. I had never consciously, deliberately looked for arguments to support a specific position. I had been trained to sort of do that unconsciously on several points. But with marriage equality, I finally said, you know what, fuck it. God supports gay marriage. Tell me your story. And I found enough support that I was able to justify it to myself. Ultimately, God didn't need my concern, my care. People did. People were happier and healthier with the people they wanted to love, and loving, kind relationships made them better. I wasn't willing to be the person who destroyed that for them just because of my understanding of God. And even if it was just a matter of, pray about it and like legitimately not pray the gay away, pray about it with God, and whatever conclusion you come to over there, it's not my business. I was willing to do that because I didn't want to destroy the good things that people had.
I think from my perspective, I always feel that, because I've been an educator, and if I'm educating a class, of 30 or even more students, then why should I think that some of them have more rights than others? To me, everybody in the room should have equal rights, irrespective of race, gender, sexual orientation. They're all just people, as you keep saying, and to me, all people should have equal rights.
And that is the right and appropriate and decent way to view things. I have no objection to that now, but I understand that for me at that time, everything, including human rights of any kind, were secondary to honoring God. Because if I didn't honor God, he would discard me. There's no better way I can think to describe it than an abusive relationship.
Yeah, I think that point's been made by a number of people, that it's like absolutely. An abusive relationship.
Everything becomes secondary to justifying yourself to that person, and you can't do anything.
I've got a couple of things to share on this one as well. And one of them actually could have fitted into any of the categories, really, in many ways. Statements of certitude, for sure. I'll give you a background on this. I actually did a video about this. The Archbishop of Sydney, who's very, very right-wing, and no doubt if he was an American would want to keep his guns and stuff like that, he asked people who supported marriage equality to leave the church. So you can actually see that part of that sentence just there. Leave our church. So the Archbishop of Perth responded because she does not agree. Interestingly, she's an archbishop, but when she goes over to Sydney, she can't sit with the other archbishops because they don't recognise her because she's female. But
right, of course. The vagina makes you far less articulate and eloquent and authoritative, as you can all see from my personal.
Yeah. Now, what she says quite here is nice to start with. All people are made in the image of God. It's kind of an assertion that she's not backing up here. But she's got the regardless of the race, sex, economic background, political affiliation, and so on. But then she's got this bit. Particular temptations that they face as human beings in a fallen world. Now, this drives me completely batty when people say this. This fallen world is because, let's face it, the world's first woman scrumped an apple. And we know.
Or a pomegranate, if you're Jewish, a pomegranate. But yes.
Yeah, you get the idea. So, we know absolutely scientifically that there was no Adam and Eve. There were no first two people. We have evolved. Maps of human evolution, are not only detailed, but becoming more detailed with every new discovery. I noticed there was a new discovery just last week. And we know there was never just two people. So this whole idea of the fallen world is just shit. And with no fallen world, there was no need for Jesus. So in a couple of sentences, you can actually just disprove Christianity. How do you feel about that?
Well, again, you can disprove the fundamentalist Christianity in which I was indoctrinated. There are a lot of liberal Christians who, meaning the best, I swear, managed to prop up the conservative absurdity by trying to justify their own faith. And it's dishonest on their part, and I'm very sick of them. But I do understand where they're coming from. They are able to say, well, this is a broader story. It's a metaphor, what have you. The truth of the matter is, a literal understanding of that story
lays all the blame at our feet for all the things that God would otherwise be responsible for. Earthquakes, plagues, famine, tsunamis, Hurricane Ike, whatever.
All the unclear messages that we talked about earlier.
Well, and that's the important thing. The important thing, theologically, is that nothing is ultimately God's fault. Because if it is, he's not good. And liberal Christians are willing to get very esoteric if it gives them enough distance from these questions, kind of hovering like a news helicopter far enough away. It's like a news helicopter, all dint, and you don't quite see details. That's what liberal theology is like. It's far away and everything is a bit esoteric. There is a certain honesty to fundamentalism, absurd as that may seem. They are willing to look at the details. They are willing to look at the details and face the consequences of them to a certain degree.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I've got one more thing to share on this, and I'm sure you've seen this before. But all the different types of marriage that appear in the Bible. And I'm sure there's more than these that I've seen before.
Yes.
But yeah, so yeah, I love this one.
Slave fucking.
Rapist and her victim. That's a good one.
Yeah.
Man, wives and concubines. And yeah, this is what gets me when they say the one man and one woman, and yet there's all these different things that are in the Bible.
And possibly 300 wives and 700 concubines if you're Solomon, depending on which mythological version of him you're going for. But yeah, the truth of the matter is, it's kind of funny because of their fear of sexual sin. Christians are least willing to admit the sexual absurdities that are included in the Bible. They will not debate that God said to slaughter the mothers and the infant babes that were male, but if you tell them that the little girls were being dragged off to be sex slaves, they will balk at that. No matter how obviously true that is from the text. Sexual sin it's a fetish. It's an idol among them. And I guess you could say that it can be an impetus to sexuality if you require that sort of, no, I mustn't, to try and, for lack of a more delicate phrase, get it up. But that's part of the idea, that they will admit to every brutality and every cruelty and every slaughter of the innocents, but they will not admit to sexual absurdities and insolence, no matter how obvious and clear the text is on those points. It's something I observe. I do not pretend to be able to justify it rationally. I understand that there is a level of absurdity there. But I know the track. I know exactly where they're going. Whatever the sexual sin is, they won't admit it. No matter how clear the Bible is that slaves can be raped and little girls can be made sex slaves and whatever else absurdity and horror there is in the text. They will admit to everything but the sexual cruelties. It's, honestly, I look at it now and I think it's just one more method of control.
So, I mean, this has been absolutely great. Just one more thing on that. When you're saying about the children being taken as sex slaves and all this sort of stuff. Does this stuff not just make you, you know, like my picture that's been on for a lot of this video, when they go on about the, you know, God being the source of morality, you know, to me, if I were a theist, I would just steer completely clear of the moral argument, because
the Bible.
The Bible is, if you actually lived by the Bible, you'd be in jail pretty quick.
Or the psych ward. You might be in the psych ward.
Yeah, that's true.
But you're quite right. The truth of the matter is, evangelicals are not willing to make the compromises that more liberal Christians are about the most literal and simple-minded interpretations of Scripture, but they are willing to steal ideas from them about God being a greater concept, the ground of all being, the ground of all morality, whatever else you need. They're willing to steal those things from more liberal and supposedly lukewarm Christians. They're willing to take anything that will give them traction. And there's a type of desperation to it. As I've said so many times, Christianity, especially evangelical fundamentalist Christianity, is desperation. And you will take that idea of God as being the ground of all being and being some kind of metaphysical basis for morality, even if you can't explain exactly what that would mean, just as long as it gives an opening to your beliefs.
Okay, but that sounds like a good place to finish.
Yes, it does.
And goodbye, viewers, and hopefully I'll be back with another interview in a day or two.